Tension crackles in the air as Officer Alex Greene shoves Marcus Reed against the courtroom's unvarnished wooden bench, snarling. Hands up. Where'd you crawl out from? Huh. Reed's fingers lift slowly, palms outward, and a hush follows. No plea, no resistance, only the unshakable calm of a man judged by skin alone. Greene's partner sneers. Try anything funny and I'll remind you who's in charge, as the two uniformed enforcers exchange a glance that says, right, color wrong attitude. That single act slamming a black man into place for daring to exist shatters the illusion of routine procedure and sets the stage for a reckoning no one saw coming. If this moment strikes you, share your thoughts below, hit that subscribe button, and stay tuned for more of Marcus Reed's story, because what follows will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice. Dawn's pale light filtered through slats in the blinds, carving stripes across the courtroom floor. The space smelled of dust-stale coffee and the low hum of fluorescent bulbs struggling to stay alight. Officer Alex Greene stepped forward, leather boots echoing on the linoleum. His partner, Officer Diaz, hovered behind, fingers drumming two steady beats against his holster, a private rhythm for a privately justified stop. Marcus Reed sat rigid in the defendant's chair, wrists bound by thin silver cuffs, shirt collar, darkened by a single crusted stain of dried blood. His eyes were unmoving, focused on some distant horizon only he could see. No cuff marks bloomed on his wrists, no tremor betrayed panic. He fit no profile on Greene's mental checklist, no criminal record flagged, no splinter of confessed wrongdoing. Yet here he was under arrest for what exactly? The officer couldn't say, and it showed in the hesitation beneath his scowl. The judge, a portly man in a robe that had seen decades of similar cases, leaned forward behind the bench. He peered down at Reed's empty file, eyes narrowing. Greene shifted on his feet as the judge's gavel rapped once for order, twice for attention. Silence bloomed like a flower strangled by its own petals. Today's docket was supposed to open with a parking ticket defendant or a minor trespassing case. Instead, all eyes landed on Reed, the man who had entered this room without comment and refused to break its brittle calm. Greene cleared his throat. "Your name," he said. His voice carried halfway to the rear benches, landing like a thrown gauntlet. Reed's jaw didn't move. He didn't seem to hear. Sir Greene repeated, brow furrowed. "State your name for the court." Reed's head lifted and he finally met the officer's glare. Each second stretched the judge, tapping his pen. Reed drew a slow breath as though inhaling every doubt that filled the room, then reached inside his jacket. Greene's eyes flicked down, expecting an ID card. A driver's license. Reed produced a gleaming silver badge, sliding it across the table with deliberate slowness. The seal caught the courtroom's light. Jonathan Pierce, Director of National Investigations. Greene staggered back as though shoved. Diaz blinked. Even the judge's pen halted mid-scratch. For a heartbeat, the entire system of assumptions collapsed into a single resonant question. What have we done? The courtroom's hush deepened, bereft of all procedure. Reed, no longer nameless, sat unmoved as though the weight of every accusation against him was a feather. His badge lay on the table like a silent verdict power withheld by prejudice had been yoked to humility that couldn't be broken. Greene swallowed. In that moment, he felt his uniform shrink, metal buttons clinging to fabric too thin to shield him from realization. He had stopped this man because of a feeling, a flicker of suspicion stoked by Reed's calm bearing, his quiet denial of fear. But this badge, placed so carefully, refused to fit the script Greene had written in his mind. Across the gallery, whispers bloomed. A court clerk swallowed, crinkling her paperwork. Spectators exchanged looks, shame, disbelief, a spark of dawning comprehension. For decades, the law had claimed neutrality, but neutrality crumbles when the hand that wields it trembles with bias. The judge sighed as if deflating under unseen weight. He leaned over the microphone. "Director Pierce," he said, voice gentle but firm. "You are claiming self-representation, is that correct?" Pierce nodded, each motion measured. "I represent myself." No one dared laugh. No one dared look away. The badge shone between them, a bridge built of unspoken truths. Greene swallowed again, feeling the knot in his throat tighten. He had prepared to justify a routine stop, some misfiring moment of law enforcement. Instead, he was confronted with a mirror, and the reflection stung more than any insult. He fumbled for words. I, Officer Safety, he mumbled, voice cracking. I suspected you might be resisting. Pierce inclined his head, eyes calm as distant water. My hands were empty. My trunk holds only this badge and personal effects. You can verify. Greene's cheeks burned. He knew the system would now tear itself apart in search of justification records, body cam footage, anything to reassert control over the narrative. But Reed's silent challenge paused every mechanism of defense. If Greene could no longer trust his gut, what was left? Protocol procedures wrote papers. Humanity saved lives. Diaz stepped forward, clearing his throat. Should we retrieve the footage, Your Honor? The judge closed his eyes for a moment as though praying for rescue. When he opened them, they were resolute. Yes, let it be played in full. Moments later, the large monitor crackled to life. Night vision grain revealed a flash of streetlight Reed's silhouette stepping from a dim alley, hands in plain view. Then Greene's voice echoed, "Freeze, police!" A hand clapped steel against Reed's back. The body hit the pavement. A shout of resisting and then blackout. Static. The judge winced. That frame is corrupted, the technician apologized. A collective breath whooshed out. Greene's lip curled. System error, he said, and tacked on a tight smile as if masking panic. But Pierce didn't react. He simply let the silence fill the space once more. Each corrupted frame, each missing second became a testament to the system's gaps and to its willingness to believe guilt before reviewing facts. The badge gleamed patient and unwavering. Greene closed his eyes. He had stopped Reed on a hunch born of prejudice. Now his instincts were useless. In their place, a reckoning rose every unjust stop he had made, each citizen whose dignity he had compromised lined up in rows of consequence. He would replay them in his mind somewhere between guilt and relief, that at least today the truth had refused to stay hidden. The judge cleared his throat. "Director Pierce," he said again, "how do you wish to proceed?" Pierce stood lifting the badge. "I wish to leave," he said simply. "I carry nothing dangerous." Greene's hands twitched. He wanted to protest, to demand protocol be followed, to reclaim the authority that had slipped through his fingers. But every word felt trivial. The man before him had exposed the fragility of power. Outside the courtroom, cameras and phones recorded each step as Pierce walked past stunned officers, past Greene's lowered gaze. No escort. No words of admonishment. Just a man resuming his day badge in full view, authority reclaimed by calm assertion rather than force. Greene watched him go, feeling the echo of that silence, following him like a shadow. The unremarkable arrest had cracked open into something far more profound, a question each of them would carry unspoken yet insistent. How often had they judged by color, by posture, by fear, and when would they pause to see each other, to truly see each other before raising a hand? As the courtroom doors clicked shut behind Pierce, the judge leaned forward. Pen poised. Greene met his eyes. No words passed. In that charged hush, they both recognized the moment would ripple through precincts, schools, living rooms, through every space where authority and humanity intersect. The routine had ended. Something new, fragile and fierce had begun. Morning light slanted through the narrow courtroom windows as murmurs rippled across the benches. Officer Diaz leaned in toward Greene, voice low but sharp. "Look at him sitting there like some marble statue. Thinks he's above us all." Greene pressed his lips together, nodding though doubt flickered behind his eyes. The judge's gavel hadn't yet fallen on the next case, but authority in the room was already fractured, its pieces ricocheting off wooden, oak, and plaster walls. A clerk at the far corner slipped her phone from beneath the desk, framing Reed's unmoving profile in the screen's glow. She tapped live, and a smirk curved her lips. "Check this out," she whispered to a colleague, the way he refuses to blink. "It's hilarious." A suppressed giggle spread to another staffer. Then a ripple of laughter bubbled through the courtroom gallery, soft at first as if testing the water. Reed's gaze stayed fixed on the judge's empty bench, but in the way he held himself straight-backed, unflinching, he seemed to widen the cracks those jeers were making. From the rear, a father tugged at his little girl's sleeve. The toddler perched on his knee, peered at Reed, and pointed. "Daddy?" she asked loudly. "Why does he look so mad?" The question hung in the air, innocently poignant, and the room froze for a heartbeat. Then an officer near the door chuckled and yelled, "Hey kid, he's not mad. He's just broke. The resulting laughter sounded off the walls like cannon fire, each boom eroding the courtroom's decorum. Even the stolid judge's clerk laughed, covering her mouth as though surprised by her own reaction. Reed didn't react. His calm was the kind of stillness that forced people to hear themselves, to catch the echo of their own voices as if for the first time. The judge's gavel finally struck once, and then twice, in a vain attempt to restore order. But laughter has its own momentum, and this one swelled into a tide, rolling chuckles from officers, snorts from courthouse staff, a few tepid guffaws from the public gallery. Greene felt it wash over him, a wave of shame rising beneath his regulation collar. Yet he couldn't stop the laughter. It seemed to pulse through the very air, fueling itself. He looked at Reed's badge, gleaming silver proof of rank and authority, and realized the room was mocking not the man before them, but the idea of someone who could call their bluff. Each cackle was a nail driven into the coffin of their presumed power. A veteran sergeant leaned against the back wall, raised his own phone. "Gonna upload this beauty," he muttered. "Title it, Statue Man Breakdown." He grinned at his phone, oblivious to Greene's stare. Greene wanted to wrench the device from the sergeant's hand to delete every frame, but he stayed rooted, paralyzed by the sight of Reed's unwavering posture. When a gust of wind rattled the windows, the clerk's live stream momentarily glitched, silencing the laughter in that tiny corner of the internet. For a breath, the courtroom was truly silent. So silent, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Then Reed exhaled quietly, each syllable of his breath, a defiance more potent than any shout. The judge's pen stilled. Diaz's foot-tapping ceased. The silence pressed against their chests, making it hard to breathe, but still the echoes of their laughter lingered like a foul aftertaste, refusing to wash away. Greene closed his eyes, recalling his partner's jeers. "He thinks he's better than us." That casual contempt had originated not from anything Reed had done, but from who he was, skin posture calm. And now that contempt had turned into doubt, seeping through every laugh line, every smirk. A young legal intern notebook open on her lap raised her pen as if to write, then froze it in midair. The only notes that mattered now were the ones written in their hearts. "What are we doing?" she thought. She looked again at Reed, saw not defiance but an unspoken question. "Do you see me?" When no one answered, Reed looked instead at the judge, then back at Greene. His eyes glinted with fatigue more than rage, as if each laugh cost him a measure of spirit, but still he held that space unmoved. The judge cleared his throat again, louder this time, and finally, the raucous echo of mockery began to fade, replaced by an uneasy hush. Greene steadied himself, voice trembling despite his best efforts. "Your Honor, He paused, aware the words would sound empty. "Officer safety," he blurted. I had to confirm he wasn't a threat. A ripple of disbelief danced through the courtroom. Safety. Were they really so scared of a silent man? Diaz exchanged a sideways glance with the sergeant, whose face had paled, perhaps realizing how small their bravado looked now. Reed's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but the barest acknowledgement. Then deliberately he stretched forward and picked up his badge. Its metal edges pressed into his palm like a reminder. With careful slowness, he held it up so every eye could see the seal of national authority, the weight of decades of rulings and reforms, the open promise of accountability. No words came, but that metallic gleam bore all the force of a thunderclap. The judge exhaled and leaned in. "Director Pierce," he said softly, "using the name they had all tried to deny the court recognizes your authority. Will you address the court now, Pierce?" Marcus Reed set his jaw. He met Greene's eyes for a moment, and Greene felt exposed as if Reed's calm gaze could pierce every layer of bias he'd ever concealed. Then Reed slowly shook his head. Silence again. His refusal to speak was a verdict in itself that no explanation could excuse their behavior. Outside the gallery, a few officers shifted on their feet, uncomfortable under Reed's stare. For months, perhaps years, they had relied on mirroring authority. The louder they barked, the more they believed they were protected. But when faced with someone who refused to mirror them back, someone who simply existed without asking permission, they felt unmoored. Their jokes and mockeries rang hollow, like fireworks that can't mask the coming storm. No one moved. The judge studied Reed's still form, then turned to Greene. "Officer Greene," he said, "please state your next steps." Greene swallowed past the lump in his throat. Each tremor of his voice felt audible to every person in the room. "Your Honor," he began, "I will ensure Mr. Pierce's safe departure and submit a full report on this incident." Those words tasted bitter. He knew the real departure would be from the comfort of their old assumptions, and he guessed too many in this room weren't ready for that. A court bailiff approached, standing beside Reed without handcuffs. His presence was polite, but every one of his movements was an acknowledgement they could no longer treat Reed as a suspect. He was both guest and judge. Greene watched as Reed stood, badge pinned back to his jacket, a silent order restoring order far more effectively than any command. When Reed walked past, feet steady, shoulders squared, the cracked floor of mockery lay behind him, and ahead lay a path paved in questions. Greene inhaled sharply, the stale courtroom air filling his lungs with guilt and possibility. Laughter's first crack had opened the door. How far would that fissure run, and how deep would the healing have to be before they could rebuild something closer to justice? The courtroom doors closed behind Marcus Reed, carrying away the echo of his quiet power. Greene remained at his spot, uniform pressed, but spirit frayed the room, now hushed not by protocol, but by reckoning. In the stillness, every heartbeat felt amplified, as if each pulse were a drum signaling change. They had laughed at him, mocked him, resisted him, and now they would live with those choices. Outside the courtroom, cameras captured Reed's departure. Social media would soon fill with snippets of mocking laughter, toddler questions, the clerk's smirk clips designed to belittle. But alongside them would appear others' stunned faces, a pause in laughter, the faintest hint of doubt in someone's eyes. Those seeds were sown today by laughter's first crack, and in time they would bear their harvest. Justice, after all, is less a verdict than a process of seeing, and Reed's silent testimony had ensured that finally none of them could look away. The moment Marcus Reed stepped out of the courthouse doors, his composed figure slipped into the collective lens of every bystander's smartphone. Within minutes, clips tagged #SilentThug and #StatueMan flooded feeds. A teenager on a sidewalk looped Reed's unhurried walk through slow-motion rap beats, subbing in a swaggering soundtrack that turned quiet dignity into caricature. "When you're too cold to care," the caption read, a neon swipe across Reed's unblinking eyes. Another clip spliced a toddler's innocent question. "Daddy, is he bad with a mocking voiceover?" "He's bad kid, real bad." The remixes racked up millions of views, each share a small grenade hurled at Reed's stoic silhouette. News channels seized on the spectacle. Early morning anchors dissected the soundless footage, replaying it in half-speed breakdowns, as if every frame held a secret admission of guilt. A slim-faced reporter leaned forward on live TV, eyebrows arched. "You tell me folks who walks into a courtroom silent and calm like they own the place." The clip cut to a split-screen reaction of viewers smiling, nodding, laughing at the absurdity. The anchor's voiceover crackled. "Tell us, is he a hero or a menace?" Comments scrolled beneath the video. "Lock him up. Nice suit, borrowed, silent but deadly." Each keystroke, each emoji piled onto a digital indictment. Amid the uproar, Greene scrolled through his own feed in the squad room. He'd pinned a live stream link to his bulletin board, thinking he'd share a laugh with his partner. But as he watched Reed's entrance looped for the 30th time, something in the overlooked stillness pricked at him. Here was a man who'd rattled the courtroom's foundations without raising his voice, now reduced to a meme. Greene felt a sting, as if he'd glimpsed his own reflection in the murky screen, sneering, complicit, unthinking. He tapped his badge suspended on its chain and wondered how easily he'd traded professionalism for prejudice. Within hours, corporate advertisers on social platforms began clamoring for soundbite clips. 90-second recaps bad guy in court segments tailored to mobile viewers. The algorithm promoted outrage. Ads for energy drinks and mid-range sedans sandwiched Reed's silent walkthrough, a jarring juxtaposition of commercial cheer over a man's quiet resilience. In the ad breaks, a tuned-up voice boomed, "Stay alert! You never know who's lurking." The very machinery meant to entertain now fueled a furnace of collective scorn. Yet beneath the hashtags and hot takes, an undercurrent of unease began to ripple. A Midwestern college student watching the TikTok remixes paused the loop whenever Reed's eyes flickered toward the camera. He typed in the comments, "This silence. It's unnerving. Why don't we hear him speak up?" A flurry of replies greeted him. "Because he's guilty." "Duh. Dude, he's in court. Go back to your ethics class." But one reply cut through the noise. "Maybe he's holding us accountable instead." The comment vanished as quickly as it appeared, deleted by the original poster, but it lingered in that student's mind. On a small podcaster's feed, a former military sergeant invited listeners to weigh in. "I watched him stand there," the host said in a low, gravelly tone, "and I felt wrong." He admitted, his voice hush. "I was ready with jokes, but something in the way he didn't react made me think, what if I'm just laughing at the wrong guy?" That confession earned a spike in downloads. Listeners called in some doubling down. He should have said something, others quietly agreeing. Maybe we're all too quick to judge when we don't know the story. Amid the furious spectacle, a single clip refused to conform. An off-camera voice asked Reed as he exited the courthouse, "Sir, did you do anything wrong?" Reed turned crown-light fringe on his forehead and said nothing. Then he added, voice barely above a whisper, "I am the law." The audio was muffled but clear enough to send chills through those who heard it. No one knew until later that "I am the law" was the only phrase Marcus Reed ever uttered that day, but it became a silent echo in millions of earbuds, challenging every assumption. The next morning, a national newspaper ran the bold headline, "The Silence That Shouts Back." The subheading, "When a man's calm stance becomes a mirror for our own bias." The article wove together bystander accounts, Reed's minimal utterance, and interviews with social psychologists. It asked in no uncertain terms whether society's quick mockery revealed deeper prejudices. Yet, even as some highbrow voices urged reflection, the bulk of social chatter remained unmarred by complexity. Anger and derision held sway. Meanwhile, Reed's phone lay abandoned in the prosecutor's office, untouched, since he'd handed it over as evidence of no pretrial calls, an ironic testament to how little connection he sought with the mechanics swirling around him. The envelope containing his self-representation forms was locked in a drawer, sealed with a file tag reading, "Director Marcus Reed confirming that the man they'd mocked was in fact the nation's top law enforcement overseer." That revelation spread slowly like a second wave of truth, but by then the initial frenzy had subsided, replaced by a pensive hush among those who'd watched it all unfold. A week after the viral storm, Greene found himself in front of a classroom of recruits, the same footage projected on a wide screen. The young cadets leaned forward, their faces flickering in the blue light. Greene cleared his throat, voice steady. "That day, you might have laughed at Mr. Reed, but I want you to think, what does that silence reveal about us? About why we judge on sight?" He paused. Because real justice, our real duty isn't to pick the loudest voice or the most dramatic moment. It's to quiet our own prejudices, to see each person as more than a suspect or an image on a screen. Some recruits scribbled notes, others stared at their shoes. The room crackled with introspection. Reed's silent courtroom entrance, once fodder for viral mockery, had morphed into a teaching moment, its drama transformed by the same silence that had sparked outrage. Viewers initially eager to condemn now found themselves unsettled, forced to question their own reactions. What had begun as gleeful disdain had become an invitation to look inward. Were they, the audience, or the actors? And Reed? He remained off-screen, unmoored from the social tempest his quiet walk had unleashed. No press conference, no interviews, no denials. His restraint made him an enigma, one that no amount of online derision could fully define. As the digital dust settled, the hashtags faded, but the questions lingered. Did we mock a man whose silence held us to account? Or did we expose the weaknesses of a system quick to judge and slow to understand? In the glow of countless devices across timelines mapped in retweets and rewinds, the real revelation was this. Perhaps the darkest complicity lay not in any single arrest, but in the casual cruelty of collective shaming. When judgment trumped empathy, silence became our mirror reflecting the prejudice we thought we'd banished. And in that reflection, none of us could remain unchanged. By mid-morning, the precinct had devolved into something more akin to a battlefield command center than the sober hall of community guardians it once aspired to be. Phones rang not with 911 emergencies, but with urgent summonses to closed-door huddles on preserving the department's reputation. In the narrow hallway outside her office, Lieutenant Dana Barrett stood beneath a glare of fluorescent lights. Forehead creased as she held an unfolded memo in one hand and her cell in the other. Every time the line lit up, her jaw clenched as though each ring carried a new accusation. The first briefing convened at 10, tucked behind locked doors where no civilian eyes could pry. The small conference room was thick with tension. 6 cots of Intel staffers, Sergeant Ramirez with his face drawn in caffeine lines. 2 precinct legal advisors in crisp suits, and Barrett herself leaning against the edge of a whiteboard scrawled with the words, "Public Trust Critical." She tapped a marker against her palm, then spoke, her voice low but carrying. "We need to answer one question. If you didn't know, why didn't you try to know?" The words felt like both a challenge and a confession. Across the table, policy analyst Jonah Myers glanced up from a stack of position papers. He cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, our updated draft recommends mandated pre-encounter profiles, extra training for officers on implicit bias, plus a requirement no traffic stop of any kind until the officer can cite concrete probable cause." He slid his glasses back into place, eyes flickering. "Because appearances and gut instincts aren't enough. They never were." Barrett gave a curt nod and the second wave of phones began to buzz. A lieutenant in internal affairs texted green light for audit, which meant they'd begun an unannounced deep dive into Officer Greene's stop and search logs. The term audit sounded almost clinical, but everyone in that room braced for the opposite exposure. Barrett turned to the 2 legal advisors. "We need a playbook," she said. "Bullet points, only our process, our commitment, our timeline. Have something ready before lunch." The advisors exchanged wary looks, but didn't argue this was no time for debate. Down the hall, 2 policy analysts, a quiet former social worker and a brash data specialist, huddled over a monitor flashing arrest statistics. The screen displayed charts of Greene's year-to-date stops, spikes of pedestrian detentions in neighborhoods where he'd patrolled most often. Next to it, another panel lit up with the ratio of stops to arrests officers across the precinct hovered around a 10-to-1 ratio, but Greene's was closer to 20-to-1. The numbers alone suggested a profligate use of authority. Corinne, the social worker, scrolled through email fragments from anonymous colleagues. "Look at this," she murmured, showing a snippet. "He acts too fast, like he's hunting ghosts." Another casual demeanor, too casual for a pro. They both realized these offhand remarks now had weight. They'd become evidence of prejudice woven into the narrative that had gone public just days ago. Meanwhile, in a dim corner of the briefing room, the oversight panel's civilian liaison, Ms. Lee tapped her stylus against a tablet. She'd been sent a separate schedule, a week of one-on-one interviews with officers, sergeants, dispatchers, and court clerks. The data Lee collected wouldn't be sanitized. She'd ask blunt, uncomfortable questions. "Did you ever feel Greene extended stops beyond protocol? Did you ever hear him say something that made you uneasy?" None of her inquiries would carry the veneer of formality. They were meant to unravel trust. Back in Barrett's office, a buzz from her desktop brought up a live news feed. Another dozen clips of Marcus Reed being slung across social feeds, not just the courthouse entrance, but every bystander angle caught on camera. The muscled calm in Reed's shoulders, as he'd produced that badge, the cold determination in his eyes. All of it was replayed as spectacle indictment revelation. Barrett auto-closed the window, her heart pounding. Internally, she admitted it had struck a nerve too. She reviewed Greene's personnel file mentally. No complaints, no reprimands, just a steadily rising trend of stops, some with no documented grounds. None of that had seemed notable until Reed's silence pulled at the fraying edges of their collective veneer. That afternoon, rumors swirled that internal affairs would visit the station unannounced. Whispers darted from bullpen to locker room. "Did you clean out your desk? What files are we supposed to save?" Greene himself appeared at his locker, elbows propped on its edges, hoodie shrugged back off his shoulders. He held a photo on his phone, still of Reed in court, captioned, "Still waiting for him to speak." He scrolled past comments. I don't trust anyone who stands that still. He thinks he's above the law. Greene's brow furrowed and he pocketed the phone. No flourish of anger, just a deep exhale as though the wind of public scrutiny might tear him apart. By 4 o'clock, Barrett's second briefing began. She stood at the head of the table idling a remote clicker. Behind her, a projector screen glowed with slides. Patterns, she said, sweeping her arm. Images appeared, maps of pedestrian stops, email quote, clouds of whispers, and a timeline showing the day Reed's viral moment dropped. The timeline spike cut through the middle of Greene's activity graph like an electric current. Notice that, Barrett said. His stop rates dropped 20% the day after the clip went viral, then rebounded 3 days later. They're not random patterns, they're reactions to public pressure. Sergeant Ramirez, who'd once admired Greene's decisiveness in the field, felt a churning in his gut. He'd been Greene's partner for months, nodding at each unremarkable detention in a side alley, trusting his instincts. Now he wondered, had he been complicit? Had he glossed over stops that felt off? He looked at Barrett, then back at the slides. No one asked for permission, but slowly they began to shift in their seats. Across the precinct, the captain's office became a nexus of clandestine activity. Invitations vanished from calendars. The captain himself, normally the bastion of calm, appeared gaunt, as if he'd been scratching at walls to find purchase. Raw data prints lay strewn across his desk, raw, unredacted statements. He doesn't look like a law-abiding citizen. I felt no risk, but still I stopped the car. The judge's clerk had noticed the blood-stained collar in Reed's shirt. Greene had described it as a scuff from a fall. But these ancillary details, once innocuous, now took on a sinister hue, tokens of carelessness, or worse, a readiness to find fault where none existed. Emails pinged into Barrett's inbox, half plaintive, half panicked. One from the chief of police status update on audit. Another from the public affairs office press wants comment on internal review. Barrett replied tersely. In progress. No comment. She also sent a covert note to the data team, flag my stops too. When a junior analyst responded in stunned tones, You want your own data audited? Barrett didn't flinch. We all should, she wrote. If you didn't know, why didn't you try to know? Late that evening, as the fluorescent hum in the precinct finally began to dim, Greene found himself alone near the rolling lockers. The building had emptied save for a lone detective reviewing files and Barrett, who peered over a spreadsheet by her office window. Greene approached quietly, voice uncharacteristically soft, Lieutenant. She turned eyes rimmed by the day's fatigue. He held out his phone, the screen displaying his own stop history chart, a jagged mountain of dots. I want to understand, he said. I don't want to be the problem. Barrett nodded, wiped her hands on a folded memo. Tomorrow we'll go through your cases. One by one. That single promise carried more weight than any briefing or memo. In that shared admission of uncertainty, they found a fragile solidarity, an acknowledgement that the institution they served was only as trustworthy as its willingness to reckon with its own blind spots. And somewhere deep in the precinct's bowels, the oversight panel's liaison locked up her notes for the night. She paused at the door, hand on the knob, recalling Reed's silent nod as he'd closed his trunk days ago. In that moment, she realized that an entire department's self-image had cracked under the weight of one man's refusal to bow. It was a fracture that could not be repaired with bullet points or hastily drafted policy memos. It demanded something more elusive and rarer, the humility to admit you've been wrong, and the courage to see the world through someone else's steadiness, and above all, the resolve to change. The next morning, Clara Matthews sat at her desk in Lincoln Elementary's 5th grade classroom, tapping her pencil against the desktop as sunlight slanted through the blinds. She'd written today's prompt on the board the night before. If you follow every rule but still hurt someone, are you doing the right thing? Now she watched her students lean forward, brows furrowed while the scratch of pencils filled the room. Little Josie Rivera paused. Mid-sentence, looked up and asked in a small voice, Miss Matthews, what if you didn't even realize you were hurting them? Clara felt a familiar jolt. This was exactly the kind of question Marcus Reed's silent stand had awakened, the realization that compliance with rules isn't the same as compassion. Later across town at Brew & Brew Coffee, barista Andre Kim slid a caramel latte across the counter and paused. He'd learned something unexpected from a neighborhood meeting about Reed's viral moment that names matter. So when Ms. Abu quietly approached, he looked up from the register and asked, "How would you like me to spell your name?" She blinked, surprised. "Asha," she replied, voice soft. He repeated it slowly as he wrote it on the cup. No scrawl, no shorthand, just deliberate letters, each curve drawn with care. When he handed it over and she left with a smile, Andre felt a quiet satisfaction. This simple act of asking had gently cracked open a space for dignity. In a small workshop behind the artisanal bakery on Fifth Avenue, brothers Evan and Malik Turner were assembling their latest batch of keychains, miniature gray fedoras cast in resin, each no larger than a quarter. They'd launched their cottage business, Quiet Caps, after seeing Reed's calm defiance spark a wave of grassroots creativity. Some customers hung the tiny hats from their rear-view mirrors. Others clipped them to backpacks as talismans of witness. Each ornament carried no inscription, no slogan, just the shape of that hat, a symbol of silent resistance. As Malik showed Evan a particularly perfect molding, he whispered, "Imagine a dozen of these bobbing on license plates during rush hour." Evan nodded already, picturing the little hats swaying in unison, a silent parade echoing Reed's steadfast posture. Over at the Midtown Police Department, Sergeant Jaime Aoki shuffled a stack of freshly printed forms across her desk. They were pilot trials. Before officers filed any citation, they were to ask a single question, scripted at the top of the page in bold. "Did I make you feel safe during this interaction?" Jamie read the line aloud under her breath. She remembered the day Greene had approached Reed, how he'd felt in control, until that silence unmoored him. Now she wanted her officers to reckon with that same awareness, to consider whether their presence comforted or alarmed. She stamped the forms, clipped them together, and handed them to Officer Lau with a wry smile. "Let's see what answers we get." By midday, the ideas had spread further than anyone anticipated. In neighborhood bookshops and co-working spaces, small groups spontaneously organized question circles. Strangers gathered around tables, coffee mugs clutched between hands, reading news articles about Reed's impact, and then sharing personal experiences. One young librarian confessed she'd once interrupted a patron mid-sentence because she presumed he couldn't afford a fine. Another admitted to never asking for a customer's preferred pronouns at her boutique. Each revelation was met with an attentive hush, and then a vow, next time they'd choose curiosity over assumption. When the afternoon bus trundled through Parkside, passengers noticed something new on every other license plate, a tiny fedora dangling from the mirror. Murmurs rose as riders pointed it out. "Is that Reed's hat?" "I think so. I saw someone post it on Instagram." In back seats, teenagers snickered until one peeled back her lip and said, "It's not a joke. It means I saw it and I won't forget." The bus driver, Mr. Klein, gripped the wheel thoughtfully. He recalled how many times he'd barked orders and assumed compliance, never wondering if the person in the back seat felt any less isolated. Tonight he planned to ask his regulars how their day had been, an extension of a quiet revolution. By dusk, an impromptu town hall meeting had formed in Jubilee Park. Neighbors sprawled on blankets under the oaks, while local activists passed around clipboards for a petition to adopt the safety form citywide. A former schoolteacher named Rosa Martinez stood and read from a homemade pamphlet. "Remember Marcus Reed's silence, how it forced a courtroom to face itself. Now let's press our city to do the same." Her voice was measured, but a hush fell nonetheless, each listener feeling the weight of her words. When she finished, hands shot up across the lawn, and for nearly an hour the community wove plans for workshops, public art projects, even an annual silent stand day where residents would pause for 5 minutes to reflect on empathy. Meanwhile, in a cramped living room converted into a civic innovation lab, tech-savvy volunteers were coding a simple app before users could post a comment on any news item about policing. The app would prompt pause. Does your comment build understanding or deepen division? It was rudimentary, just a pop-up box with 2 buttons. But as its developer Mia Chen explained on a live stream, it was enough to jar people out of reflexive outrage. Even a tiny glitch in our reaction can mean the difference between empathy and contempt, she told viewers. As the first stars appeared, each of these small gestures, question asking in classrooms, barista, name checks, Miniature fedoras, safety forms, grassroots dialogue, and mindful tech coalesced into a quiet chorus, each note harmonizing with Reed's silent refrain. The rituals of authority that had once gone unquestioned were subtly, irreversibly shifting. A teacher no longer assumed a student's compliance guaranteed understanding. A police officer no longer wielded power without checking its impact. A cafe worker no longer used a name as mere label. Communities no longer accepted the status quo without pause. And in the heart of it all, the memory of one man's calm refusal to play his prescribed role continued to reverberate silent ripples that reached far beyond a single courtroom, reaching into every daily interaction, every routine exchange. The movement was still inchoate, pulsing with tentative energy. No grand proclamations marked its spread. Instead, it took shape in hushed questions, thoughtful naming tiny totems of solidarity, and the simple courage to consider another's experience. These silent ripples gathered strength, promising that whenever authority whispered its old assumptions, it would no longer go unchallenged or unremembered. Weeks had passed since Marcus Reed, now known to few as Jonathan Pierce, sat silent under the courtroom lights. In that time, the slow revolution his calm had sparked rippled outward, reshaping classrooms, coffee shops, and precinct briefing rooms. But nothing in those weeks felt as seismic as the hush that settled when Reed stepped into the federal liaison office that chilly morning. He wore the same unassuming gray suit and fedora that had become his silent emblem. On the broad mahogany table before him lay a single manila envelope, unmarked, unsealed, yet charged with the weight of every assumption that had once attended his arrest. Lieutenant Dana Barrett, steely-eyed and unaccustomed to uncertainty, slid the envelope across to him without a word. Around them, the senior agents and policy advisors who had once traded incredulous whispers now sat straighter as though bracing for a verdict. Reed picked up the envelope. His fingers unhurried, his posture as composed as on that first courtroom day. He folded back the flap, withdrew a crisp credential, and let it rest for a moment in his palm, an unspoken promise of authority. Then he flipped it over and regarded the room with steady blue eyes. "Jonathan Pierce," he said, voice quiet but undeniable, Director of National Investigations. The effect was instantaneous, a collective intake of breath as if the air in the room had suddenly gained density. Barrett's knuckles whitened around her pen. An internal affairs analyst halted mid-note. Even the intern in the corner who'd been reviewing Greene's stop history data froze, gaze locked on that silver-badged fact. Pierce did not linger on the moment. He slid the badge back across to Barrett, who took it with a trembling hand, fear and awe warring in her eyes. He offered no explanation, no flourish. Instead, he leaned back, folded his hands in his lap, and for the first time that morning, let silence speak for him. At first it was a hush, thick with shock, as if everyone in the room were afraid to let their own voices shatter the fragile bubble of revelation. Then Barrett cleared her throat, the sound cracking the tension like the gavel that once rang in that courtroom. "Director Pierce," she began, voice low, we didn't understand." The words trailed off, too small for the magnitude of the moment. Pierce met her gaze without judgment. "You didn't know," he repeated, a mirror of the words that had become a moral refrain nationwide, "and now you know." His tone held neither triumph nor apology, only the quiet finality of truth revealing itself. In the ensuing minutes, the room came alive in slow motion. Questions trickled out. "How long have you held this position?" "Why reveal it now?" "What does this mean for Greene's inquiry?" Each query collided with Pierce's deliberate calm. He answered only when necessary, each sentence dropping like a stone in still water, ripples extending far beyond those walls. By lunchtime, word of Pierce's appointment had slipped out beneath the official press embargo. Phones buzzed in precincts coast to coast. In a precinct just outside Atlanta, officers who had once mocked the silent thug now exchanged grim looks over their morning rosters. In a classroom in Denver, a teacher paused the history lesson to announce Class Y have news. "The man we've discussed is our new Director of National Investigations." Gasps and wide eyes replaced doodled fedoras in the margins. Back in Washington, meanwhile, a late afternoon television briefing hastily convened played the clip. In near silence, Pierce holding the badge revealing the credentials the room's stunned faces. The anchor spoke over it in measured tones. A moment that redefines authority and accountability. No punditry, no rushed analysis, simply the footage and the gravity it carried. That evening, at a follow-up town hall in Jubilee Park, Rosa Martinez repeated the development to her neighbors. "He's in charge of the very system that once treated him as a nobody," she said, voice tinged with wonder. The crowd, once fragmented in their experiences, found themselves united in a new question: if someone you've been taught to dismiss can hold the highest power in justice, what assumptions must each of us discard? By week's end, classrooms had adjusted their discussion prompts. Authority does not guarantee fairness. How will you hold those in power to account? Baristas at Brew and Brew had updated their name spelling cups Please. Director Pierce, they'd write a small gesture of acknowledgement. The quiet caps fedoras had sold out again, and new designs in pewter and brass carried tiny inscriptions, "Know before you judge." In precinct headquarters, Lieutenant Barrett gathered Greene's data analysts. Director Pierce wants a full review of every stop in the past year, she announced, replacing hesitance with purpose. Officers who once whispered too fast now considered the meaning of professional instinct with fresh skepticism. And in homes across the country, families conversed about Pierce's story as though it were a personal moral test. Parents guided children through the implications. If rules alone don't protect dignity, how will you speak up when you see someone treated unfairly? All the while, Jonathan Pierce maintained his unforced reserve. He conducted no press conferences, granted no interviews. The badge he unveiled in that liaison office became a symbol less of individual power than of a system finally confronting its blind spots. His presence demanded no applause, only reflection. In the weeks that followed, laughter in courtrooms no longer reigned unchallenged. When a prosecutor tried a flippant stand-up "please read Pierce," merely met their gaze and the room fell into respectful silence. His badge had become more than a title. It was a reminder that authority finds legitimacy only through acknowledgement, empathy, and the readiness to learn what it does not yet know. And so the movement seated by Reed's quiet defiance came full circle. From the raw hush of that mahogany table to the hum of cafes, from grassroots fedoras to federal policy boards. One man's deliberate calm had unfurled into a mandate to see, to pause, and to hold ourselves accountable before we judge another. In the end, the badge was never the power, only the proof that the power of silence wielded with integrity can reshape an entire system. The courtroom felt impossibly small the moment Jonathan Pierce's badge settled back onto the mahogany bench. Officer Alex Greene, who had cocked an eyebrow at Reed's silent composure only days before, now sat rigid, his uniform creased, but his confidence in tatters. The judge, a man whose gavel once instilled fear in every spectator, hovered midair, finger pressed against the wood, as if frozen by the weight of what he had just witnessed. Around them, the gallery bore the same unspoken dread. Police academy recruits whose snickers had echoed through these aisles, a mother tugging her son's sleeve in initial pity, a retired detective murmuring doubts under his breath. All of them had played roles in a farce they no longer understood. Greene's throat tightened. A single bead of sweat traced his temple, a luxury for him to sweat at all, while he replayed the revelation again and again. Jonathan Pierce, Director of National Investigations. A man his colleagues had mocked as a silent thug and an extra in a crime drama, now sat atop their entire chain of command. Authority reversed itself like the flipping of an hourglass. The sands had dropped through, and there was no turning back. The judge finally lowered his gavel, but the sound was softer than authority. It was a question mark. "Counselor Greene," he rasped, voice brittle. "How do you wish to proceed?" Greene swallowed hard. No rehearsed declamation remained. The carefully constructed script charges of obstruction, the clerk's reading of rights, the judge's measured directions lay in wreckage at their feet. He looked not at his notes, but across the aisle, searching for Pierce's gaze. He found instead only a quiet stillness as unyielding as a mountain. Whatever words Greene summoned felt insignificant. In their place, he managed a single utterance. "Your Honor, I request a brief recess." The judge inclined his head, relief flickering behind his eyes, but made no ruling. He too needed time to pause to sift through the collapse of courtroom ritual before daring to speak again. The bailiff stepped forward soft as a shadow and called a recess. Chairs scraped, papers rustled. The hum of whispered conversation rose like distant waves. In the back row, the retired detective exhaled, startled by the sudden emptiness. We mocked him, he muttered to the retiree beside him. All those jokes. I can still hear them. The other man's face was pale. He nodded but could not meet his friend's gaze. A mother clutched her child's hand, eyes brimming. What have we done? She whispered. The child, only 7, stared at Pierce with wide curiosity, untainted by shame. Mommy, he asked, why did they laugh at him? The woman could only shake her head. No comforting answer existed. In the aisle, a group of academy cadets exchanged uneasy looks. One, an earnest young woman named Torres, closed her notebook with trembling fingers. We've got to report this, she said. I can't let this go unspoken. Her partner, eyes cast down, nodded. A moral line had been crossed, one that the uniform no longer hid. Greene retreated to the judge's bench. He sank into the clerk's chair, heart pounding. Around him, recording devices lay, silent body cams, courtroom microphones, the judge's live stream feed. Each had captured the entire calamity, but none offered a remedy. The law had no clause for mistakenly ridiculed the nation's highest investigator. Not yet. He reached for the file, the charging document binders of prior stops, emails smearing him as overzealous. Now those papers felt like weapons in the wrong hands. He closed the folder and slid it aside. In his chest, something dropped an emptiness, equal parts shame and awakening. At the front, Pierce remained where he sat, his fedora angled low, his coat smooth and unwrinkled. He did not rise or speak. Instead, he folded his hands in his lap as though weighing the next move in a game only he fully understood. His silence commanded more attention than any testimony. After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared his throat again. Director Pierce, he began, voice steadier. The court acknowledges the extraordinary circumstances of this proceedings. Given your unique status, we must reconsider our approach. He paused. The phrase, we must proceed with fairness, felt hollow. What was fairness in a courtroom where the power dynamic had been upended? Pierce tilted his head as if listening beyond the words. At last he spoke. Your Honor, I have no desire to complicate your docket. The matter before you is the question of whether one man's dignity can withstand unchecked authority. His gaze swept the room. I yield to your discretion to determine how best to administer justice here. He did not demand removal of charges or insist on dismissal. Instead, he placed the burden of decision back on the court, on those who had misjudged him. Silence flooded back, heavy and unpassable. The gallery leaned in, suspended in that moment before resolution. The judge's gavel lay inert, waiting for a purpose. Greene glanced at the clerk, who raised an eyebrow but offered no counsel. This was no longer a routine hearing. It was a mirror held to every participant's face. None could look away. Gradually, the judge reached for the gavel and rapped it lightly. A call, not to order, but to reflection. This court will adjourn to deliberate a suitable course of action, he announced. The hearing is suspended until further notice. Another recess, but this one carried the weight of an implosion. The courtroom emptied in hushed dignity, participants stumbling through the unfamiliar choreography of contrition. Outside the courthouse, the winter sky was a pale canvas. Reporter cameras lingered on the doors as they closed behind them. Social media had already ignited, hatched masterless, trial trended within minutes. Opinions poured in, some proclaiming Pierce a hero, others declaring the court compromised. But beneath the headlines, a deeper reckoning unfurled. Justice itself had been laid bare. Greene stepped onto the marble steps, the late morning chill biting through his uniform. He paused, stared back at the entrance. He had expected exoneration, or at worst embarrassment. Instead, he found disorientation. He felt his authority dissipate with each breath. He was unmoored in a world where the man he once dismissed wielded the true power of conscience. Down the sidewalk, the retired detective sat on a bench, head in hands. The weight of laughter he had once considered trivial now pressed on his ribs. He called his grandson, voice unsteady. I need to apologize. The grandson listened silent as tears pooled in the old man's eyes. A block away, Lieutenant Barrett convened her team in a glass-walled conference room. The overhead lights glinted off tablets showing green stop history patterns, now flagged for urgent review. But the data felt secondary, an inert echo of human error. She closed her laptop with resolve. "We start by reviewing our biases," she said. "No more silent assumptions." Her officers nodded, some blinking back tears. The precinct's moral compass had shattered. They would rebuild it from the wreckage. Elsewhere, the fedoras, those miniature tributes to Reed's silent stand, had sprouted on virtually every license plate frame. A cottage industry had burgeoned. Merchants spoke of fedoras for fairness proceeds, funding legal clinics. Students at a local high school staged pause and reflect sessions, asking peers to share stories of overlooked dignity. Across the city, polite inquiries replaced brusque commands. "May I ask your name? Is there anything I can do to make you feel safe?" In these small gestures lay a quiet revolution of empathy. And above it all, Jonathan Pierce, no longer an accused outsider, moved with graceful purpose. His office door bore no nameplate, only a brass emblem of the Department of Justice. He never mentioned the trial, never referenced the laughter. He convened listening sessions with community leaders, inviting testimony on encounters with law enforcement. He oversaw training modules that paired courtroom footage with personal reflection exercises. He turned his own trial into a curriculum for public redemption. Months later, the courthouse reopened that very courtroom for its next docket. But when users logged the schedule, the entry for State of the Union versus Jonathan Pierce remained blank. No hearing date, no status update, just an empty line. It was as if the trial had never needed an ending, for its truth had already pervaded. In the silence left behind, the heaviest gavel of all had spoken a moral imperative that outlasted procedure. The participants, Greene, Barrett, the judge, the gallery had faced their own reflections. Some faltered, some flourished, but none returned to that morning unchanged. For one man's stillness had become a summons to see each other more clearly. And in that void where the script collapsed, they discovered the true weight of justice, not in verdicts handed down, but in the empathy one cannot afford to withhold. Morning broke over the city like an unexpected verdict. Streetlights surrendered to the advancing sun, but inside precinct headquarters and municipal offices, darkness lingered. Keycard scanners glowed an unforgiving red, denying access to officers even at their own desks. Computer terminals flickered. Access denied across the screen. Bodycam archives, locked evidence folders sealed. Mobile dispatch units unresponsive. No memos were pinned to bulletin boards. No press releases heralded a new chain of command. Yet every desk sergeant, detective, and patrol officer understood that something fundamental had shifted overnight. Lieutenant Dana Barrett arrived early. Coffee untouched in her hand heart, hammering like a gavel. A blinking alert on her tablet bore one line, Directive 027B. All records under federal review. No unauthorized retrieval or modification. Pierce Oversight Protocol active. She exhaled the breath catching in her throat. The precinct's carefully constructed data silos, the same ones she had built her career protecting, were now under the watchful eye of Jonathan Pierce's office. She tapped the screen, but every file she tried to open vanished. The only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights, harder now than ever, as though the building itself braced for inspection. In the roll call room, uniforms hung stiff on hooks like marionettes awaiting instructions. Sergeant Coe, a veteran of 20 years, stood before a wall of monitors. He traced his fingers across a live feed from a downtown traffic stop, an old plastic cup rolling beneath the wheels of a patrol car, a juvenile biker weaving distractedly. In any normal morning, this footage would have been routine training fodder. Today it was inaccessible. Coe pressed his palm to the glass, meeting his own reflection. The line he'd crossed yesterday, he now realized, was more than just a courtroom affront. It was a fracture in the very premise of local autonomy. Dispatchers, too, felt the tremor. Calls came in emergency reports, traffic collisions, domestic disturbances, but messages from Pierce's office overrode routine protocols. A quiet voice crackled through the encrypted channel. All field reports to be copied to Federal Secure Archive in real time. Any unverified transmissions will be automatically suppressed. The dispatcher's eyes flicked to her partner, silent alarm flashing between them. They had only begun to process Reed's No Pierce's revelation. Now they were enmeshed in an invisible net of federal oversight. Out on the streets, patrol cars idled at stoplights that felt too still. Officers accustomed to immediate discretionary power now tapped at their tablets, waiting for permissions that would not come. A fresh recruit named Martinez looked up from her screen, brows furrowed. "Captain," she ventured. "Why can't I pull up my last 10 traffic stops?" My supervisor said. "I need authorization." The captain stared back, mouth set in a grim line. Because he said quietly, "Chief Pierce has locked it down. We're being audited at every level." He turned away, boots echoing against the asphalt as he resumed his patrol. City Hall, too, registered the seismic shift. A sleek glass tower housed the mayor's cabinet, where policy aides once shuffled proposals and budget requests by the dozen. At dawn, their email chain sputtered to life. All municipal law enforcement budgets subject to federal review until further notice. No equipment purchases or fleet upgrades without direct approval. A young policy director named Bell stared at the subject line, heart pounding. Her desk drawer held a pen gifted by Officer Greene, a token of gratitude from the man who had once arrested Jonathan Pierce. Now it felt like a burden, a reminder that no one was safe from the reach of the badge they had ridiculed. Meanwhile, inside a dimly lit server room tucked beneath the armory, IT specialist Chang flicked switches with deliberate calm. He had been instructed to reroute every data stream 911 logs, CAD reports, fingerprint databases into a secure federal enclave. As he pressed the final keystroke, the network map pulsed local nodes, grayed out trunk lines lit in austere blue. Chang's reflection hovered on the monitor, his expression unreadable. He had served loyally for a decade, but in this moment even he felt the weight of accountability unequally distributed. The question hung in the stale air, who exactly would protect the protectors? At the state capitol, legislators convened hurriedly. Committee chairs gathered behind closed doors, poring over memos stamped "Urgent Presidential Directive." The speaker's voice jittered through the crackling line. "We must maintain order, demonstrate cooperation. Failure to comply could trigger sanctions." One senator leaned back, chewing on her pen. "We're giving up our authority," she said in a hushed tone. "In one night we went from sovereign oversight to federal vassals." There was no applause, only the somber acknowledgement that the era of local immunity had ended. Yet across town, everyday life carried on in the subtlest ways. At the corner coffee shop, Lila the barista looked up from her register and asked each customer, "How would you like your name spelled today?" With that simple question, she joined the quiet movement that Pierce had inspired. Patrons blinked with surprise, but then smiled, some shyly, some gratefully. Outside commuters noticed new decals on their bumper, a miniature fedora beside the words, "See Me." Even as federal scrutiny tightened its grip, these gestures whispered of shared dignity, the everyday ripples that refused to be locked down. By midday, encrypted orders had reached every law enforcement agency in the state. A terse directive: cease all unmonitored surveillance. Compliance officers will oversee operations until further notice. Surveillance vans parked outside courtrooms, local precincts, even juvenile detention centers, equipment pointed inward. Agents in dark suits, federal liaison officers hovered at doorways, ID badges glinting. Their presence was unobtrusive yet omnipresent, like the hum of hidden machinery. Personnel who once laughed at Reed's silence now passed them in the hallway without eye contact, boots padding in uneasy rhythm. Lieutenant Barrett found herself summoned to one such covert meeting. In a nondescript conference room, she sat at a long table flanked by two solemn men in plain suits. No name tags. No insignia except for the faintest shimmer of an eagle on their lapels. One slid forward a tablet displaying an aerial map dotted with red and blue markers. "We are initiating a cross-jurisdictional audit," he intoned, voice low and measured. "Your department's SOPs will be evaluated against national compliance standards. You will cooperate fully." Barrett nodded, chest tight. She had trained her entire life in state law. Now she was student in a curriculum she had not chosen. Unseen throughout the day, local police radio traffic sputtered into pockets of silence. Calls for backup routine dispatch check-ins, direct officer-to-officer coordination, all filtered through secure gateways. Radios emitted static glimmers of familiar voices now anonymized. An officer who tried to hail his sergeant got only a computerized reply. "Station command cannot be reached. Please try again." He stood alone under the amber streetlight baton slung at his side and realized that the support he once took for granted had evaporated. At City Hall, an aide whispered to the mayor that the federal oversight extended even to his personal security detail. His own drivers and bodyguards were being vetted for loyalty. The mayor, once proud of his political capital, now sat at his desk in a bare suit jacket, palms flat on the wood. He wondered what it meant to govern when every decision, every move risked triggering a federal audit. He closed his eyes, recalling the morning he shook hands with Jonathan Pierce, congratulating him on a community award. That handshake now felt like the handshake of complicity. By late afternoon, whispers spread that Pierce himself had not issued a single public statement. No press conference, no televised address. He remained an unseen hand operating through encrypted channels, enacting a quiet coup that forbade dissent. Reporters staked out his office cameras trained on the imposing stone façade of the Department of Justice. But day after day, no figure emerged. Only directives cascading through databases, rippling through code, rearranging authority in real time. In the State House basement archives, a clerk named Nguyen discovered a fist-sized envelope slipped into her in-tray. Inside was a single crisp directive. Effective immediately, all surveillance footage of Director Pierce prior to his appointment is to be transferred to federal custody. No local copies retained. She recognized the gravity the man they had once jeered at had outmaneuvered them at every level. Her heart fluttered with admiration and fear. Even Nguyen, an unassuming archivist, felt the seismic shift in her bones. As dusk settled, patrol cars crawled home under street lamps that no longer felt reassuring. The city had rearranged itself around unseen boundaries, invisible wires that humbly proclaimed who now held the ultimate reins of power. Everywhere, officers carried handheld devices, whose glowing screens served as silent reminders. Their pensions, promotions, and reputations now flowed through Pierce's office. Somewhere down the chain of command, Greene's captain sat alone in his office, hands trembling on his desk. The letter of commendation he had once received from the local sheriff had been eclipsed by these encrypted orders, orders he dared not question. Yet in quiet corners of the city, hope flickered. Small community forums sprouted on social media. How we're adjusting to new oversight. Faith leaders convened interfaith vigils, candles flickering at sundown, intent on nurturing the empathy Pierce's presence had sparked. Even students in civics class debated whether federal intervention was a betrayal of local autonomy or a necessary correction to unchecked power. Their voices echoed with conviction, unaware that they too were part of the ripple of change. That night before bed, Lieutenant Barrett stared at her badge, her life's defining emblem. At its center gleamed the state seal framed by oak leaves. She traced its edges with her fingertip. The metal felt weightier now, as though bearing not only her authority, but the responsibility of those she controlled. She whispered into the dark, "We will learn." It was a promise both to Jonathan Pierce and to herself that local law enforcement would emerge from this oversight, not diminished, but reoriented toward true accountability. And elsewhere, Jonathan Pierce sat in a windowless office, the only light a muted glow from his secure terminal. His image was no longer hidden, but he remained unseen. Encrypted messages arrived, compliance reports, data breach alerts, civilian feedback logs. He read each one with quiet acknowledgement. Then, with deliberate calm, he tapped a command. Proceed with Phase 2. No one witnessed the keystroke yet around the city. Circuits hummed with renewed energy. Records decrypted oversight offices stood down, but a single line glowed in every system. Remember, power unchecked is power corrupted. By midnight, the city had settled into a new rhythm, one calibrated not by local decree, but by the silent mandate of an unseen director. The hum of surveillance drones overhead was softer now, but more precise. Data streams flowed steadily outward and back and monitored and mirrored. And in the subdued glow of street lamps, patrol cars parked in neat rows, engines silent but ever ready, a quiet testament to a world reshaped by a badge once concealed beneath a humble jacket. The federal intervention was complete, and no courthouse, no precinct, no heart in the city would ever be the same again. The sunrise caught the edge of the courthouse steps the morning after, like a spotlight on a stage left in shadow. Inside, in a windowless sub-basement chamber, locked behind steel doors with no markings, a small group gathered around a single monitor. The flickering screen displayed rows of grainy black and white footage, 1-second frames stitched into a silent film of their own worst selves. Every mocking grin, every whispered jab, every offhanded derision captured in haunting detail. This was not law enforcement gone awry. This was an experiment, one that had operated for 3 years under the unblinking gaze of Jonathan Pierce. Detective Lorraine Kim, still wearing her uniform, though she'd been pulled off patrol months ago, watched the first clip in silence. It showed a junior officer sliding his phone across the bench to play a looped TikTok remix of Pierce's motionless court entrance. Laughter erupted around him as synthetic beats dropped in the background. The camera panned close on Pierce's unreadable face. The screen flashed with mocking captions, "Silent thug, when you're guilty, but can't even talk." Kim's throat tightened. She recognized every bystander in that hall, friends, mentors, colleagues, their own voices, their own laughter, recorded forever. Next came an overhead shot of the courtroom gallery, a toddler's plaintive cry. "Is he a bad guy, Mommy?" The mother's embarrassed whisper. A chorus of chuckles from uniformed men who should have known better. Temple Quiet cameras caught the gleam of amusement in their eyes. Behavioral analysts had time-stamped each moment, tagging them not as evidence, but as data points. Amusement peak, 09:14:32, scorn, wave, 09:16, 05. Cold, clinical terms that drained the humanity from the scene. At the center of the group, Pierce's former second-in-command Special Agent Ruth Calder swallowed hard. She had spent years crafting internal affairs protocols, training officers in mindful enforcement and implicit bias awareness. Yet here she was face-to-face with proof that the system she helped build had been kneecapped not by criminals, but by its own practitioners. She remembered her own laughter at a colleague's offhand joke about civilian cosplay, the joke that had circulated as a logo on coffee mugs. Now that joke glowed red on the behavior analysis dashboard, operational bias marker level 4. The screen shifted to a clip of Lieutenant Dana Barrett, head bowed, trying to access her own precinct's records, only to be met with access denied. In the footage, Barrett's fingers trembled over the keypad. Her face was etched in frustration that spoke volumes of vulnerability. The frame froze on her eyes, so full of questions, so starkly alone. Pierce's architects of the experiment had circled that moment in bold text, defensive breakdown indicators of authority erosion. No one skipped a beat. No one dared laugh. Outside that corridor of confession, the world had already shifted gears. State troopers monitored their own dashboards, finding encrypted directives, rerouting their every digital trace to the federal archive. City Hall policy wonks discovered that every memo they wrote, every budget line they project, would be sifted through analysts' filters before it saw the light of day. No press conferences trumpeted these changes. They happened in silence, silent bites of code that traveled the network's veins. Back in the chamber, the group now watched audio-visual overlays of the training session meme sessions from the FBI Academy, where cadets once cracked wise about Pierce's impassive glare. The screen displayed side-by-side stills, ancient grayscale recording of Pierce's silent court sojourn, and a modern PowerPoint slide titled "Improper Expression Under Scrutiny," complete with snarky clip art. The room exhaled collectively as the realization settled in their own instructional videos meant to fortify ethical resolve had become the very tools of their undoing. The final reel began with a black screen. Then in stark white text, Project Mirror Ethical Self-Exposure Study flashed before fading into an overhead grid of hundreds of faces, smug smirks, open-mouthed guffaws, acid twists of ridicule. Beneath each face, a tiny ID number and a color code: red for active mockery, orange for passive compliance, yellow for silent discomfort. Kim's own badge number glowed orange, threshold exceeded empathy. Filter failure. She felt a chill crawl down her spine. Pierce's voice crackled through the hush like a verdict, though he never spoke a word in public. A recorded address from months earlier, captured by hidden mics, now played over the montage. If you don't know why you laughed, the mirror will tell you. If you don't feel what you've done, the data will make you listen. His tone was neither accusatory nor apologetic, just steady, as if reading from a ledger of outcomes. Special Agent Calder closed her eyes. She had once believed that truth would be found in quietly correcting misconduct, in confidential reprimands, in quiet retraining. But here lay the proof that half measures and whispered warnings had done nothing to halt the rot. Only total transparency, every emotion captured, every bias mapped, had forced accountability into being. The screen then shifted to civilian reactions. Footage of coffee shop patrons asked to spell their names aloud, smiling in relief. A teacher in Chicago pausing her lesson to ask, if following the rules still hurts someone. Are you right? Students scribbling the question on the board. Justice begins when you see the person's face, not when you cite the code. These snapshots glowed green, positive moral shift, a powerful counterpoint to the red and orange. Lieutenant Barrett wiped her eyes. She recalled the first days after Pierce's identity was revealed, how laughter fell silent in precinct hallways, how officers stood guard by their own self-consciousness. She remembered training sessions where social media mockery had been shrugged off as harmless, dismissed as juvenile prank. Now those mocking videos were archived in the moral audit folder, labeled Data for Remediation Planning. Detective Kim raised her hand, voice soft but unwavering. What now? This footage, these metrics, do we rebuild trust by sentencing every offender, by firing those who laughed? Or do we learn to see ourselves first? The room fell silent, each person grappling with their own conscience. In response, the monitor displayed a final slide, Phase 2. Cultivating reflective practice, followed by a concise directive. All personnel will undergo weekly moral impact briefings, reviewing one clip at a time. No defensive statements permitted. Reflect. Discuss. Integrate. Calder exhaled. Pierce's experiment wasn't a punitive purge. It was a curriculum one, where each mind was the classroom, each laugh the lesson. The moral test had been unearthed, not a trap for scapegoats, but a mirror for self-exposure. Pierce's silence, once misread as weakness or evasiveness, had been his most potent tool. He had allowed them to speak first to reveal their predispositions. Then he showed them what they had chosen. As they filed out of the chamber, eyelids heavy with unspoken resolve, the hallway light seemed softer, less clinical, more forgiving. Each step carried the weight of a promise to pause before laughter, to question the comfort of mockery, to seek the humanity beneath every badge and uniform. Above ground, the city moved on taxis, honked sidewalk vendors called out their wares. Yet in every cafe, classroom, and precinct station house, the moral test lingered. Jonathan Pierce's silent experiment had ended, its data laid bare. But for the nation, the real work had only just begun to confront their own worst impulses and decide whether they would be defined by them or rise above, guided by the clarity of the unblinking mirror he had held up for all to see. The sun had long dipped below the pines surrounding the Quantico campus by the time Jonathan Pierce slipped quietly into the back row of the closed symposium hall. A hush fell as the young agents, fresh from academies from Seattle to Miami, caught sight of the man whose name had become legend, though none present had ever seen his face in person. No brass band heralded his arrival. No spotlight found his charcoal suit. He simply moved with the same measured calm that had marked every step of the moral experiment he had orchestrated. The foyer beyond the thick wooden doors had buzzed with nervous energy, just minutes before cadets straightening ties, swapping theories in low voices, some speculating what he might say. But that all evaporated when the doors closed. Here, suspended between expectation and dread, the room felt too small to hold the weight of what Pierce represented. The polished black chairs stretched in neat rows. The low hum of an unseen projector whispered overhead. And at that precise moment, silence became more than absence of sound. It stretched palpable like a taut canvas awaiting Pierce's first brushstroke. He settled into his seat without ceremony, notebook resting on his knee, fingers brushing the leather binding as if seeking its reassurance. A ripple passed through the audience, should they stand. Applaud offer whispered greetings. The hall remained motionless, each face a study in anticipation. Had his presence finally undone the protocols they'd all once trusted? When the moderator, a gray-haired veteran with more medals on his chest than Pierce, had years finally introduced him, his voice cracked, betraying a tremor rarely admitted in official settings. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest needs no introduction, Jonathan Pierce. He stepped back, eyes meeting Pierce's for a heartbeat before drifting away. Now it was Pierce's turn. He rose with the same quiet authority that had defined every scene of the trial and the years of repercussions that followed. He carried himself not as a conqueror, but as an observer re-entering a theater he had briefly left. Brushing a lock of dark hair from his forehead, he glanced down at the upturned faces before him, eyes wide, mouths parting almost imperceptibly. Then he tipped his head toward the microphone. The hush in the room grew dense, as if every breath would shatter the fragile moment. He spoke 7 words I came to see the system reflect. No flourish, no preamble, just the simple truth he had lived. For 3 years he had asked them to reflect, to look beyond procedure and into the mirror of themselves. Those words hung in the charged air, a final lesson delivered not with force, but with the grace of restraint. In the back row, a cadet closed her notebook and let it rest on her thigh. 2 seats over, an instructor's hand trembled the pen he had been nervously spinning a moment ago, clattering to the floor. From the front, a retired colonel's eyes glistened, recalling courtroom footage of mocking laughter, now forever etched in memory. One by one, the audience absorbed Pierce's 7 words, not as a teacher's decree, but as a challenge carved into their own souls. He lowered his head back toward his notebook as though finished. The hall exhaled collectively, slowly, reverently, as if the very act of listening had cleansed every conscience present. A single cough rippled through the space, the only punctuation to the sanctity of that silence. And then nothing. No applause, no shuffle of feet, no spontaneous outburst of affirmation. Instead, each person sat in stillness, grappling with the gravity of what had transpired. Moments passed. The projector clicker sat forgotten on the lectern. The moderator stood uncertain, glancing toward the exits with the look of a man caught between duty and awe. A young agent in the second row reached out to steady himself against the back of the chair in front of him, as if the words had unsettled his very axis. A mutual understanding rippled through the group. Pierce's point would live not in speeches or memos, but in the silent recalibrations they would carry home day after day. When the meeting finally ended, the agents rose as one, no marching cadence, no synchronized applause, just a gradual lift of bodies bound by realization. Pierce gathered his notebook, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the exit with the same unhurried grace, leaving behind a room that felt irrevocably altered. They did not follow him to the door. They did not call out his name. They simply let him depart, understanding that his lesson was complete the moment he spoke and ended the moment he stepped away. Outside, the night air felt strangely alive. Crickets chirped in irregular staccato beyond the glass doors. In the parking lot, headlights winked as cars pulled away. Yet none of that raw energy diminished the hush that lingered in their chests. Each person walked to their vehicle deep in thought, replaying those 7 words on an endless loop. I came to see the system reflect. In the days that followed, Quantico's corridors echoed with muted conversations. Instructors no longer bore down on trainees with the same rigid protocols. Instead, they paused before every drill, every lecture, and asked, "How did that feel?" In the mess hall, cadets, once eager to swap courtroom gossip, sat in small circles discussing the morality of a silent gaze versus shouted orders. Training modules were rewritten not to drill compliance, but to provoke introspection. What does your silence say about you? Read the first slide of the new ethics seminar. And somewhere off-site in a secure archive, Pierce's experiment files were sealed behind a new vault of encryption marked not as classified, but as indispensable. Senior officials pored over the data not to assign blame, but to trace the sinews of institutional behavior where mockery had flourished, where empathy had faltered, and where the faintest pivot toward conscience had taken root. He never returned to center stage. No award ceremonies invited him to speak. No think tank panels offered him a platform. Yet his presence persisted in policies drafted in classroom debates. Ignited in that moment, each agent felt the weight of accountability hover over their uniforms. Real justice didn't need proclamation he had shown them. It only needed the courage to pause, to look inward, and to change. Months later, veteran officers who once shrugged at body cam footage found themselves petitioning for bystander footage reviews. Baristas still paused to ask patron names. Elementary teachers in neighboring towns introduced respect pauses in their lesson plans where students learned to stop before laughing at another's expense. And license plates across the state bore tiny fedoras, quiet emblems that spoke of dignity over derision. Jonathan Pierce's name faded from headlines, but the echoes of his lesson did not. In the justice system's daily machinery, where case files moved like conveyor belts and verdicts fell with mechanical regularity, there now lived an empty space for reflection. A pause button had been installed on the machinery itself, a safeguard against the rush to judge a circuit breaker for the impulse to mock. And whenever someone caught themselves smirking at a clip of a stoic figure or felt the twinge of rushed fear before calling a patrol, they heard an echo of Pierce's final words. I came to see the system reflect. In that echo lay the true power of his experiment. Not forceful reform decreed from above, but a quiet reawakening kindled in each heart. For justice lived not in verdicts handed down, but in the invisible shift within every conscience willing to pause, to learn, and to change.